On this night, one individual has successfully transcended the barriers of time and space and returned to the late 18th century to relive and attempt to change one 24-hour period in history. But this night will hold a terror that is eerily familiar, for it is the terror at Collinwood. Welcome to Terror at Collinwood. I am your hostess, Penny Dreadful, aka Danielle, and I welcome you to the podcast that celebrates dark shadows. I have a few news bites for you before we jump into today's show, so let's get right to it. Mitchell Ryan's new autobiography is out. It's called Fall of a Sparrow. And of course, Mitchell Ryan played Burke Devlin in Dark Shadows. He was the first and the archetypal Burke Devlin. When I think, no offense to Anthony George, but when I think Burke Devlin, when I hear that name, Mitch Ryan is the actor who comes to mind. He owned that role. It's sort of like Alexandra Moltke with Victoria Winters. You know, when I think Vicky, it's Alexandra, and it's the same with Burke, especially if you watch all those pre-Barnabas episodes, because Mitch Ryan, he wasn't in a ton of episodes once Barnabas came in before Anthony George took over, but if you watch the pre-Barnabas episodes, he's a huge player in those episodes. Anyway, Fall of a Sparrow is out. It is his autobiography. It's available on Amazon and Barnes & Noble. He's had an incredible career spanning decades. He's in his 90s now, and it is available now. All right. Well, I am all about sharing the love on Terror at Collinwood, and I want to let you know about other Dark Shadows podcasts that are out there. In fact, I recently found out about a Dark Shadows podcast that I had no idea existed, and it predates this one by about a month and a half, I think, or a couple of months. I think they started in March of 2020, and I think I posted my first episode May 1st, 2020. And this podcast is called Between the Shadows, and it's hosted by Kristen and Kara Tillitz. I believe they're sisters, and they're going storyline by storyline, and they're discussing their thoughts on it and giving their feelings about it and discussing the characters, and in a similar vein to what I'm doing here. Clearly, they love the show, and it is a cool podcast. I encourage you to check it out. It's on YouTube, but it's also on the podcast streaming apps like Apple Podcasts. I'll post a link to their YouTube channel in the YouTube description for this episode of Terror at Collinwood, so you can find them. I ran across them, and I was really excited to see there was yet another Dark Shadows podcast. But wait, there's more. There's also Resident of Collinwood. He is on YouTube, and he does a variety of topics pertaining to Dark Shadows and other horror topics as well. He has guests on. Definitely check out a Resident of Collinwood. I will link to his channel too. But wait, there's more. Of course, there is the Literary License podcast, which is not just a Dark Shadows podcast. They discuss a variety of topics. For example, they talk about Bewitched. They also do book to screen. They compare a book to a movie. They also talk about the TV show Soap, but they have a devoted Dark Shadows episode discussion, and they interview a lot of the actors and people who worked on the show. I've had Tom Diamond on this show as a guest, and I've been on the Literary License show myself. For those who are more into the fanfic side of things, there is the Pit of Ultimate Dark Shadows podcast, which features a wild crossover fanfic that's ongoing. It's been going for quite a while, and it mixes Dark Shadows with like the Addams Family, for example. Like they have quite a few different properties and fandoms that get into the mix. It's quite humorous, and it's been going for a while. So that one's Pit of Ultimate Dark Shadows. There are also podcasts that are no longer running but are worth checking out the archives for. Of course, there's the Collinsport Historical Society podcast, which is well worth seeking out. There's some great interviews there. There are great topics that are discussed. That one is available on all of the podcast apps. And there is also The Drawing Room, and that podcast was going for a while, and it was a husband and wife. Chrissy and Russ were the hosts, and they would take like a block of episodes and talk about, kind of like what Literary License does. They take a block of episodes and we'll discuss that block of episodes. I don't know if those episodes are archived anywhere though, and I think they did they got up to like the Adam storyline, I think, before they ended up pulling the plug on the podcast. Those episodes might be archived somewhere. If somebody knows, let me know. I'd be happy to link to them, but I don't know if they still exist. So those, and I'm sure I'm leaving someone out, and if I am, I apologize. It's not an intentional slight. I am definitely all about, informing people and spreading the love and celebrating Dark Shadows. All of these, the more Dark Shadows podcasts there are, the better. Why do we do Dark Shadows podcasts? Why do we do these types of things? And I've asked myself that, and I've obviously, because I'm a huge fan, but also I'm probably preaching to the choir here about this, but I'm frustrated by Dark Shadows' underrepresentation in pop culture, and I think it's up to us, the fans, to get the word out. We shouldn't just keep Dark Shadows within the fandom, hiding it in the secret room of the mausoleum. And I get it. We all tap into this world as fans, and it's important to us, but I also think we need to make more of an effort to share it with pop culture enthusiasts in general, especially if you're a creator. Dark Shadows can and should be part of the pop culture parlance in the same way that, say, Star Trek, The Twilight Zone, Doctor Who are, things like that. It should have been celebrated, for example, at San Diego Comic-Con for its anniversary in the same way that 66 Batman and Star Trek were. And yet it wasn't. I think, except for Hermes Press was there, and I think that might have been the year Catherine Lee Scott and Lara Parker were there with Hermes Press. But it was sort of under the radar. It was just listed in the program, but nobody made a big deal about it at Comic-Con. Meanwhile, Star Trek and Batman were everywhere. I wore a Dark Shadows t-shirt there. I've been to San Diego Comic-Con maybe 5 or 6 times. It's a grueling experience. It's worth going to once if you love all stripes of pop culture. But I had a Barnabas shirt on, and somebody came up to me and thanked me for wearing the Barnabas shirt to represent Dark Shadows at Comic-Con. Dark Shadows was a phenomenon in America in the 60s and early 70s. It was more popular than Star Trek at the time. And don't get me wrong, certainly Dark Shadows continues to have a presence among genre fans. It has a place in pop culture history, and it's more on the radar than, say, Sliders or Voyage to the Bottom of the Sea or something like that. Those shows do have followings as well, but not at the level of Dark Shadows. However, it's still not where it should be as far as I'm concerned. It's not at the place in sort of the pop culture lingo, the pop culture zeitgeist, where it deserves to be. Dark Shadows should be part of that discussion. It should be in the reservoir of knowledge of pop culture enthusiasts, let's put it that way, particularly when we're discussing the importance of the show in terms of Gothic horror, Gothic romance, dark fantasy, and forming that bridge between the 60s monster craze and the 70s monster craze. Dark Shadows was instrumental in that regard. Dark Shadows is definitely key when considering how hugely important it's been to serialized storytelling in genre television, horror, sci-fi, fantasy. Why? Because Dark Shadows created the mold for sustained serialized storytelling in genre television. That's taken for granted today by many of these shows that are like that. Most of those genre shows, horror, sci-fi, fantasy, speculative fiction shows, are serialized these days. And things like those Netflix shows or HBO or any of that stuff. You could also say Doctor Who was a key there, but those stories tended to be grouped into chapters. You'd have that story of Doctor Who and it would be self-contained, and then you'd have another one. And it might reference previous stories, but it was sort of serialized in its own chapter, right? Whereas Dark Shadows was a sustained ongoing serial for 5 years. And yes, Dark Shadows had beginnings and ends to storylines, but it was an ongoing daily serial. And of course, we know how Dark Shadows' depictions of monstrous characters, especially with regard to Barnabas, has had a massive impact on the genre. Dark Shadows is hugely important, and I'm determined to open that secret room to the mausoleum and let it loose, okay? So where did this disconnect happen? how did Dark Shadows go from having 2 major motion pictures, being on board games, model kits, bubblegum cards, horror head pillows, being on the cover of all these teen magazines and monster magazines, etc., the list goes on, to being relegated to only MPI home video products and occasional one-off items from other companies? Where are the Dark Shadows Super 7 reaction figures and NECA statues and adult collector figures? Where are the Mego horror figures? Like, I know Spectre Toys did Mego style, but now Mego itself is back with lots of horror figures. It seems like every other day there's a horror character being released. Where are the Dark Shadows figures? Where are the Dark Shadows video games and role-playing games? Where the hell is my Barnabas Collins Funko Pop? I hate Funko Pops. I'm sick of them, but I'd 100% buy a Barnabas. I'd be first in line. Where are the references to Dark Shadows or a Barnabas cameo, say in, Simpsons Treehouse of Horror? Why hasn't The Chilling Adventures of Sabrina tossed in an Angelique reference? Or better yet, had Lara Parker come in to play a role or make a cool cameo appearance? Sure, yes, there are references, for sure, in pop culture. Maybe I'll do an episode on that someday, references to Dark Shadows in popular culture, because that's always fun. I always get a kick out of that. The most recent one that comes to mind were the vampires watching Dark Shadows in the final season of Supernatural. And it was great to finally see that nod in a show that actually owes something to Dark Shadows. But gosh, we definitely need more of that. Like, that should be something that's just as common as references to the Twilight Zone or Doctor Who. It just should be. And yet it isn't. It's only occasionally when you see a reference to Dark Shadows. Once in a while you see it, but not nearly enough, and not nearly as much as you see references to other things that are comparable. And I think it's because there was a disconnect along the way. There was a disconnect that happened. Like, how did Dark Shadows go from, magic slates for kids and Ben Cooper Halloween costumes of Barnabas to nobody in my class in high school knowing what the hell Dark Shadows was? How did it go from that point A to point B? And I think the disconnect happened in the syndication era in the 70s and 80s. Dark Shadows went into syndication in the 70s and then into the 80s. And that's how I watched it when I got to watch it in syndication in the 80s on the bootleg tapes that my uncle got, but then also on Channel 58 out of Vineyard Haven. But it was a big commitment for stations to carry it. Quite a few did, and that's how I got to see it. But we're talking a ton of episodes that had to be played every day in order. And World Vision, the syndicator, charges a lot from what I hear. Now it's available on streaming like Tubi and several other places where you can watch it. But for the syndication in the 70s and 80s, World Vision was charging a lot. And it was a lot for stations to keep track of all those episodes. Conversely, when you look at something like, say, Lost in Space or the George Reeves Superman, it's a lot easier for stations to carry something like that. And what I'm saying is, for a whole generation in the 70s and 80s, up until the Sci-Fi Channel era, a lot of people didn't or couldn't really watch Dark Shadows. Plenty did, but a lot couldn't because the stations weren't carrying it and wouldn't make that commitment. And thus, those people didn't know what it was, or maybe they'd heard of it from a relative, but they didn't know much about it. I think that's why you occasionally see a woefully misinformed magazine writer or blog writer not mention Dark Shadows when they're writing some Halloween article about the history of horror TV. I was recently told about that by a fan, that it was like some article recently about the history of horror TV or vampires or something. Dark Shadows didn't get a mention. It's sad. And it's our job as fans to politely let those writers or editors know that this was an oversight. I'm not saying don't flip out on them because you don't want to get that reputation for being, crazy fan, but it's okay to let them know politely and in a reasonable way that Dark Shadows should have been in there and it was an oversight, and let them know why it was important to have that in there. Another thing, in addition to loving Dark Shadows, I'm a huge classic horror enthusiast, especially Gothic horror. I'm a big fan of that stuff. All of those classic horror films, Universal Hammer, Corman Poe, all of that stuff, Bava films, the literature, classic horror, radio plays, everything. I love that stuff. And as a college professor, I'm even teaching a class right now called Literary Themes Terror, and I'm incorporating some of the stories that inspired Dark Shadows storylines. And in the past, I've taught courses on Edgar Allan Poe and H.P. Lovecraft. I'm a big fan of that. Like, whenever I get the opportunity to teach a class like that, I go for it. I also hosted a horror movie show on TV for 10 years, and I continue to host Halloween specials. To say I'm a big fan of classic horror would be an understatement, but I've never been a fan of soap operas, and I have nothing against soaps, of course. If you think General Hospital is groovy and you love Days of Our Lives, that's awesome. But while Dark Shadows used a daily serialized format, in my eyes, it's far removed from anything I think of when I hear soap opera. And I think that label among horror fans and genre fans has somewhat stigmatized the show a little bit among those enthusiasts of that type of stuff, horror, sci-fi, fantasy. I mean, it's ridiculous, but I have seen that knee-jerk reaction coming from the background of somebody who loves classic horror, is involved in the classic horror fandom to some extent, knows a lot of people in that fandom. There are plenty of people who do love Dark Shadows, and they don't think that's not an issue. But when some people hear soap opera, they immediately put up a wall. I'm telling you, I've seen this. And all I can say to that is, look, the Gothic horror genre works very well in a serialized format. It always has. Horror and fantasy, anything like that, it works well in a serialized format. I've mentioned before the Penny Dreadfuls and the Shilling Shockers, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, that was a serialized story. All of that stuff, Sweeney Todd, the String of Pearls, Varney the Vampire, all of that stuff was serialized. Dark Shadows fell right into that tradition, okay? We can use that slang phrase, soap opera, but it's also 100% speculative fiction. It starts as Gothic romance right away. I mean, they're talking about ghosts, and we don't know yet if it's metaphorical or literal, and it turns out it's both metaphorical and literal. There are ghosts in many respects on the show, and many other things, as we find out, as it transforms from Gothic romance to Gothic horror and dark fantasy, and this hybrid of Gothic romance, Gothic horror, and dark fantasy. It's all mixed in there, right? There's time travel, vampires, werewolves, witches, a cursed lottery room, a living severed head, a parallel universes, ghosts, warlocks, zombies, mad scientists, a disembodied hand that can make your desires come true, usually at a price, Frankenstein, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, a mad woman locked in a room that comes right out of Jane Eyre, Lovecraft craziness. I mean, come on. You compare that to All My Children, and you're looking at something entirely different, okay? This is dark fantasy. It's Gothic horror. Throw this back at people who cross their arms and look down their nose and tell you they won't watch a soap opera, and tell them by that logic, modern age comic books are out the door, because those are soap operas too. Most genre shows nowadays, they're all soap operas. If we're going to use that label, right? Game of Thrones, Stranger Things, all that stuff. Even non-genre shows, okay, like Breaking Bad had an ongoing soap opera structure. Old movie serials, comic strips. I mean, I could go on. And obviously I have, at length, and there's more to come. That stigma has got to go. And that's why I tend to refer to the show as a serial versus using the phrase soap opera, because it's just, there are certain connotations attached to that. I think Catherine Lee Scott referred to in one of her books, or several of her books, as, ladies sitting around the table, drinking coffee and knocking knees. That's the image that comes to a lot of people's minds when they hear soap operas. And it's like, that's not what Dark Shadows is. There are soap opera elements. The monsters fall in love. And let's not forget, I'm going to get to that in just a second, but the huge impact that Dark Shadows had on the depiction of supernatural characters as protagonists. That's massive. That was a massive, important thing that Dark Shadows did. And you could say, well, they use soap opera tropes to do that. Like the monsters on Dark Shadows all are capable of falling in love. Okay, we'll get to that. Another roadblock I've seen people put up is the gripe when it comes to production values and bloopers and stuff like that. In my opinion, those folks need an imagination tune-up. Okay, you have to watch these things considering the era in which they were made and the resources available. Dark Shadows was like 5 live theater shows a week and churned out with intense energy. That's part of what's cool about it. Sometimes mistakes happen, but if you can't suspend your disbelief because of that, time for an imagination tune-up. That's it. It's how I feel when people laugh at the effects or styles of acting in classic horror films, or just classic films in general. And I'm talking about good classic movies. And that makes me sad, because the creativity and effort it took to make those things back then is cooler to me than something that you can make on a computer nowadays. And yeah, I understand the techniques and the technology have evolved, but it's important to also appreciate what could be done in the context of when something was originally made. And it's important to look at Dark Shadows through that lens. I get that it's a lot of episodes for the casual horror or genre fan to take in, and I'm talking about if we're trying to get people into Dark Shadows to kind of get it out there, get more awareness of it. 1,225 episodes is a lot, and most people aren't going to do the whole thing. But I think there are gateways, and I think we have to be open to sharing with our friends, okay, which I didn't used to do. This is coming a long way from somebody who used to think of Dark Shadows as my precious. I wouldn't share it with anybody. It was like my thing. Like that, my uncle and I would watch it, my cousin Karen, that was it. It was the three of us watching, my grandmother too. I didn't really share it with my friends because it was like, I don't know, I guess I didn't want them to dump on it or something, like it meant a lot to me. So now I think it's important to share. And for me, I think it's a lot of episodes. When you tell somebody there are 1,225 episodes, a lot of people are going to not react well to that or say like, whoa, how am I going to watch all that? But they're gateways. 1897 is my gateway drug of choice when I suspect one of my friends is going to dig Dark Shadows. And this is what I mean. We have to share the show instead of just keeping it to ourselves. Like, this is our special thing. And I get why. I get the desire to do that. I also share that in some respect, and certainly did when I was younger. But we need to keep Dark Shadows in the pop culture zeitgeist. It still is to some extent, for sure, but we need to perpetuate it more, I think a good way to do that is, especially if you're a creator, writer, artist, director, actor, TV show producer, podcaster, YouTuber, etc., put references to Dark Shadows in your work. Just throw in a reference. If you work on something that's horror, sci-fi, fantasy related, particularly, why not make the choice to throw in a Dark Shadows reference? Just the way somebody will throw in a Star Wars reference, right? A Barnabas poster in the background, a reference to Collinsport, anything like that. It's that easy. Keep the spirit going, Now, I ask myself the question, and I'm going to wind down here in a minute. I promise my rant will be over. But I ask myself the question, do I want Dark Shadows to be as popular as, say, like Star Wars or Lord of the Rings or Marvel and DC, like something huge like that? I mean, if I figuratively had the hand of Patofi, like if I could use the hand of Patofi to make that come true, would it end up disfiguring Dark Shadows? If Depth Shadows had been the result of that, and if that Depth Shadows had been a huge hit, it could have potentially rewritten what Dark Shadows is in the public consciousness. And that's not a price I'm willing to pay, because a lot of people know what Dark Shadows is, but a lot of people don't, especially globally. So Dark Shadows has been on simmer for a while. There are plenty of people know what it is. A lot more people don't know what it is. And it's on simmer, and then you get a huge hit that's a mockery of the show, a parody of it. I'm not willing to pay that price, but I would like to see Dark Shadows at least attain a higher profile than it currently has, with more pop culture awareness of it, more merchandise from different companies besides MPI, more references in other media showing that Dark Shadows is part of the public consciousness, especially horror media. Things like what they did in Supernatural. I'd love to see more of that. And if you're a creator and you're listening to this, why not make that choice to do that? Taika Waititi and Jermaine Clement, where's the Dark Shadows reference in What We Do in the Shadows? Where's the Barnabas reference, guys? Come on. Throw in just a nod to it somewhere, Let's not keep it locked away in a chained coffin in the secret room. We must break the chains and let Dark Shadows be free to live the life it deserves, whatever that may turn out to be. Okay, enough of my insane sermon. If anybody ever questions my fandom and obsession with Dark Shadows, you can play this for them, and then they'll know that I ain't playing with a full deck, probably, I guess. At least I mean well, okay? I want Dark Shadows to not ever fade away and to still be at the level of all these other things that are also cool. Let's keep it around. All right, let's get to the show. I am really excited to introduce my guest today, my friend Roberta Andrade. She is a perfumer at Roberta Andrade Fragrances and studied perfumery and cosmetics at Perfumers World. She's a creative soul from the Commonwealth of Massachusetts and has a love for all things spooky. Friends and family call her Robin, so you'll probably hear me refer to her as Robin during the show. We've known each other for a number of years, and I am delighted to have her here today. Welcome to the show, Robin.
Thank you so much, Penny Dreadful Danielle. I'm so happy to be on your show today.
Yeah, well, we both have two names. It's funny.
Yeah,
Robin and Roberta and Danielle and Penny.
It's really funny when I hear the name Penny. Of course, I think of Penny Dreadful and I think of you, but I also think of an old movie from way back in the '80s called Buckaroo Banzai, and
oh yeah,
and there was Penny Pretty.
Penny Pretty, yes.
Yeah.
I love that.
That was played by Helen Birkin.
I love that you dropped a Buckaroo Banzai reference right off the bat, like before we even got started. This is a sign of good things to come, folks.
Oh yes,
you know what you're in for now. Robin and I have geeked out for many years about many different films and TV shows and all kinds of stuff. So Robin, tell us about your introduction to Dark Shadows. How did you get into Dark Shadows and when?
So I was really little. So I was one of the original kid fans back when I was, I couldn't have been more than 6 or 7 years old, because I'm the last of 6 kids in my family. And we all went to a Catholic school in Taunton, Massachusetts. And so my brother, who's 2 years older than me, and my next sister up, Claudia, who you know, we went to the same school, because back then in those Catholic schools, you had everything from kindergarten all the way up to 8th grade. So we all went together and we all came home together. And Dark Shadows was becoming a thing, especially in the mid 60s, 67, 68. And this must have been about 68 because, otherwise I think I would have been too young. But my first memory is just my sister Claudia wanting to get us home right away for 4 o'clock to make sure that we could be in front of the TV to watch Dark Shadows. So we would all run home like Dark Shadows, and we would be running home because no buses back then. You literally had to walk uphill both ways. And and we would go and watch Dark Shadows, and I loved it. I loved the whole atmosphere of Dark Shadows. It was Gothic and gloomy, and there was always a thunderstorm going, and there was always lightning in the background blowing and all of that. And I just love that whole spooky atmosphere about the show. But that was how it started. And of course, I was introduced to Barnabas Collins as one of the main characters, because I think by the time I started watching it, I think the whole piece with Laura Collins and David's mom, the Phoenix part was done. I think I got to see that because I think I was a little too young to even have registered it as a kid. So, but I loved Dark Shadows and I loved Barnabas Collins, and my mother was working at the time. So it was just the 3 of us. We would go home and watch this. We get really mad at my sister. Don't let her watch Dark Shadows because she has nightmares. And I'd be like, but I want to see Barnabas Collins.
I love it.
So I'd have this argument with my mother that I didn't care whether I had nightmares. I wanted to see Dark Shadows because I wanted to see Barnabas, because I had a wicked crush on him. Even though he was the evil guy, he was also so suave and, and sophisticated and, had an accent and the whole bit. He was very attractive to me. So that's how it all started. And I have to tell you one thing before I forget. To this day, I have a Pavlovian trigger. Anytime it's thundering and lightning outside, I want to watch episodes of Dark Shadows.
Perfect time to watch it. Definitely.
Isn't it cool?
Yeah. Oh, that's great. Just you get that urge when you hear it.
I do.
It's that association with the thunder. And I love it. That's great.
Yeah. Yeah.
Even though it was a daytime show, it's such a perfect, now that we have, home video and streaming it, we can watch it anytime, and it works so well at night. It's such a great time to watch it when it's nighttime. And if it's a rainy night or even a rainy afternoon,
Oh, yeah.
thunderstorms out, it's just perfect
Yep.
atmosphere for it. Yeah.
Yeah, it
Now,
really is.
yeah. Now, did you continue watching it once you discovered it all the way through, or was it like an on and off thing, or did you
Yeah.
keep?
Yeah, it was kind of on and off. I watched it when we were kids, and then I think it was either something where my parents finally went out and didn't let me watch it anymore, or it changed the time. I don't recall if it stayed on the same time at 4 o'clock every afternoon.
Mhm.
Um, but yeah, I kind of lost track with it for quite a while. Did end up seeing some of the episodes from the 90s and some of the movies, and I love those as well. And then I think before the unfortunate movie with Johnny Depp, I start to watch it again. I think it was one of those rainy, thundery sort of summer afternoons, and it was like, ooh, Dark Shadows. Let me see if I can find that on YouTube. And I found like someone who had a real big cache of them on YouTube. And I started watching them again. And I got up to like episode 250 something, where Willie finally finds Barnabas and Barnabas comes back and all of that. And whoever had this cache of the Dark Shadows episodes got busted because of copyright,
Right. Mhm.
copyright infringement. And I couldn't watch anymore. And I was like, no. So I finally got the box set and started watching the box set.
The coffin box, right? You picked that up.
Yes, I have the
Yes.
coffin box. Yeah.
Yes. Oh, great. Yeah, that coffin box set is pretty epic. And of course, now all of the episodes too are on the Tubi app, which
Yes.
is free. Yep, with
Yep.
commercials, but
Yep.
it's they're all on there, easily accessible, and they're on other places too. Pluto has them too, but they don't have Pluto doesn't have them all, but they have a lot of them. And then Decades plays part of the show, but not all of it. Usually during
Right.
Halloween. Mhm.
Right. Now, I think it's Pluto allows you to see it, but it's sort of like they have a Dark Shadows channel, right? And
Yeah.
you can only watch whatever they're showing at that time. So you can't. And I've noticed, like, I've watched it at night, and they'll have one area of the whole story going on. Then if you watch it during the day, they might actually be playing it from a different place. It's not contiguous, is what I noticed. So
it's Pluto's not I don't think Pluto's the ideal place to go. I think if you don't have the DVDs, I think definitely Tubi is the way to go. And I think they're on Amazon too, but I think you have to pay. Yeah. Yeah. So Dark Shadows is plenty, which is funny because back in the in the 70s and in the 80s, like you really, and even into the 90s until the Sci-Fi Channel started running it, you had to like really have it in syndication in your area to be able to watch it in reruns. Do you remember catching any syndicated episodes in around the area? I know we grew up around the same areas, like, do you remember any airings at that time in the early 80s or anything?
I really don't. I want to say that perhaps at one point in time, they might have been playing it on channel 56.
I think you're right. I think they did at night, like really late, like at 11 o'clock at night or so. I think so, briefly. Yeah, I'm pretty sure you're right about that. And then I know my uncle Val had gotten like bootleg tapes, fifth generation copies from out of state, and but which had the Barnabas episodes, and then 1795, and then channel 58 out of Vineyard Haven out in the Cape, which was a UHF station, started playing it, and he got a roof antenna so we could watch it. And I think that must have been sometime in the mid 80s when we were watching that at that point. But it was like it's one of those things where you like had to know where it was to get it.
Right.
But awesome. And I'm so glad you got that coffin box set, because that thing is amazing. Now today, since you have been exploring all the different storylines, filling in the gaps in a lot of ways here. There's one particular storyline that I thought would be really fun to talk about with you, which is the return to 1796. The 1795 storyline in Dark Shadows is iconic. It was the storyline that followed the introduction of Barnabas story, and it gave us the full-blown origin of Barnabas Collins and introduced Angelique into the show. It was a major storyline. It was mega popular and iconic, and it had a massive impact on the series because they kept returning to it. Dan Curtis loved 1795, and the show would either have a dream sequence where you'd see 1795. There'd be brief flashbacks to it leading up to this. There was a Eve who was brought to life using the spirit of Danielle Roget, who, there was a whole flashback scene with where she went back. She had a relationship with Peter Bradford, pre-Vicky, all of this. So we saw some glimpses of this storyline. I say 1795/1796 because the year changes mid-storyline. But now this is such an interesting little storyline. It's like an island in the middle of another storyline because the Quentin ghost storyline started. The werewolf storyline has started at this point. And Victoria Winters has been drawn back into the past by Peter Bradford. Vicky's been gone for a couple of weeks, and all of a sudden we're getting signs. Something really bad has happened to Vicky in the past, right? And the first sign of this, the beginning of this storyline within a storyline, is Vicky's clothes appear in the wardrobe in Collinwood. And then the music box, Josette's music box, shows up, and inside of the music box, there's a note that says, "I am alone. Help me. Help me."
Right.
And so Barnabas feels that this is a sign from Vicky. Vicky needs help. Something is wrong in the past. And finally, this is confirmed when David takes a picture of Barnabas and Carolyn standing in front of the doors to Collinwood, to the foyer. And we see in the background the image of a woman hanging from the gallows with a noose around her neck. And it's Victoria Winters, who is now being played by Carolyn Groves, the third and final actress to play Victoria Winters. The role was originated, of course, by Alexandra Moltke, iconic. Everyone, we think of Vicky Winters. It's
right. It was
Moltke.
her.
It's her.
Yeah.
I mean, she owned that role, but Betsy Durkin took over the role for a time, and she did an admirable job. And so did Carolyn Groves in the short time that she played the character as well.
Carolyn Groves really kind of looked like Alexandra Moltke too.
Yes.
They did look similar, similar hair colors, size of their face, the blue eyes. They really did a good job with the casting. But it was funny, like as I was watching these episodes again, the whole thing with Vicky's clothes coming back. So you got Mrs. Johnson moving Vicky's clothes into a box along with the music box. And the first thing I thought was that David and Amy were messing with everybody because they were two evil little kids.
They were. I think it was a little from column A and a little from column B going on there. There were both aspects at play, because part of it was David and Amy at Quentin's behest, kind of messing with everybody because Barnabas wanted to take them away to bring them to Boston.
Yeah.
But then the Vicky stuff starts happening, and David and Amy are a little baffled by it. And there's even one scene where Amy calls Quentin on the phone and on the old telephone. And
says, "Did you do that?"
And Quentin says, "Quentin's just as baffled as we are," which is wonderful. I love that. It's like Quentin's like, "I don't know.
Let me phone a ghost. Let me see."
Right. Yes. Only on Dark Shadows. So things culminate, of course, in the graveyard. We see the grave of Peter Bradford. And then, and then this freshly dug grave appears in Eagle Hill Cemetery, and then a gravestone appears. This is Victoria Winters on it. So unlike the first round of events where Phyllis Wick switched places with Vicky at the gallows at the last minute, and Vicky was whisked back to the present, There is
Right.
no Phyllis. We don't know where did Phyllis Wick go? I don't know. She is out in the ether. Some poor Phyllis Wick has vanished from the universe. Apparently, maybe
Well,
she.
didn't Phyllis Wick die on the gallows when she switched places with her in 1795?
Yes. Yeah,
So
she did.
she's dead.
So this time Vicky is now in the past here. She's back and she's gone back to the past. And Barnabas determines that he must go find Vicky and save Vicky. So I'm going to just throw this out there. Like, what are your overall thoughts on this side? I almost wasn't going to count it as a storyline because it's so short, but it really is its own encapsulated storyline. It lasts, including the build up to it and the actual trip to 1796. It lasts about 2 weeks, which is as long as the 1995 storyline lasts down the road, which I will definitely devote an episode to 1995 for sure as well. And I said, well, this kind of counts as its own encapsulated storyline because it's completely disconnected from what's going on at Collinwood in the present day. So anyway, what are your thoughts just generally on this storyline?
So I thought it was kind of cool. So I'm kind of a geek when it comes to all of these things about timelines and, and time paradoxes and all of those kinds of things. So I was really kind of, I was kind of paying attention to some of those things, but I think it was a really cool idea that there was some sort of way that Vicky was reaching out through from the past to get Barnabas's attention. And I thought about something really interesting about the note, first of all, the note in the music box. So if you think about time travel and you think about what could be standing in the same place years later, it was the house, right? And certain things about the house. So if you were trying to get somebody's attention in the future, you, in your present time, would go and leave a note someplace where they'd find it. Something like that. So that's the first thing I thought of when I saw the note. It's like, did she somehow get a note stuck into the music box before she got jailed or something like that allowed her to make sure that somebody would see it? The only thing I think that was interesting about that was that they were saying, Grayson Hall was saying, she was going, it doesn't look like Vicky's handwriting.
Right.
So that was the one thing that was a little bit weird about that. Now, then we get to the picture. Now that was just such a cool effect to actually have that in the photograph. And that certainly at that point I was going, okay, this isn't David and Amy messing with these guys.
Yeah.
Something beyond that. And then when they go, when they go to the graveyard, and Vicky's stone appears, then that time is changing in the past, and Barnabas needs to go do something to help. I like the idea that you didn't need a seance to travel through time. You actually could just petition somebody spiritually from the past or the future to basically will you into that period of time. So I thought that was a cool way to transport Barnabas back. The one thing I did question, and help me with this because I can't remember, was Barnabas already dead in 1796 or presumed dead? Was he was a vampire in 1796, correct?
But yeah, the period in the timeline where he arrived in 1796, he was already a vampire at that point.
He was already a vampire. His family thought he was dead.
Yes. A few people knew he was still a vampire.
Ben knew that he was a vampire, and Ben's and Barnabas's dad knew.
Yes.
But the thing that got me about this that I was kind of questioning was, okay, like in the first time travel thing where Vicky goes back in 1795 and she displaces Phyllis Wick, right? And Phyllis Wick comes forward. Okay, so now we've got this one where Barnabas is going back in time. So I was wondering why they didn't have present day Barnabas displace 1796 Barnabas where they switched places.
Oh, that would have been interesting.
That would have been really cool. All of a sudden, 1796 Barnabas is going, what the hell is going on? What am I doing here?
That would have been fascinating. Oh man, to transport, they swap places, like transport, because they don't really address how that works.
Right.
Barnabas beseeches Peter Bradford to bring him into the past, which Peter brought. This was the easiest time travel on Dark Shadows ever, because subsequent ones, they use the I Ching or Quentin's stairway into time. There are like devices and techniques to do it. This time, these is just help me come to the past. So Peter brings him to the past, but it's almost like the present day Barnabas. He merges with the 1796 Barnabas, and they become one being. So he is in the body of the 1796 Barnabas, but he has all the knowledge of the present day Barnabas.
Right.
So it's but they in when they do the I Ching time travel, he astrally projects his spirit into his past body, and they explain it that way. So I assume it's a similar technique at play here, but it's he seems to physically disappear from the present and merge with his past self. I think a swap would have been fascinating, because then you would have had that version of Barnabas operating in the present day, and that would have been really cool. Definitely,
that would have been cool. I wonder too, so again, because being geeky about time things like this, time paradoxes, it's almost like, to me, it would have made better sense for them to swap, so that one was displacing the other. And again, you and I talked about this before. When Barnabas first meets Victoria Winters, why didn't he know who she was? Because of all of this time travel.
I always chalk these things up to the mysteries of time travel, because in the present day timeline, when Barnabas met Vicky in 1967, the seance had not yet been held that sent her back into the past. Therefore, that didn't take place. Yeah, I mean, time travel is so confounding, to try to explain it. But after the seance, he has now met Vicky in 1795. And it seems as though, at least initially, Barnabas seems to almost have two sets of memories of what took place. At least that's the sense I get. He remembers Phyllis Wick, but he also remembers Victoria Winters. He seems to, and when he's talking about Vicky, he talks about remembering her in the past. So perhaps the new series of events, the altered series of events, eventually like supersedes the old series of events, but maybe there's a period of time where he remembers both sets of events. Because we see this happen later, a similar instance with David and Amy, where Quentin's ghost, obviously takes possession of them and corrupts them and has them do awful things. And then they become terrified of Quentin's ghost, and Quentin almost kills David. And Barnabas, after altering events in 1897, Quentin's ghost no longer exists. Quentin doesn't die in 1897. He is now immortal. Yet David and Amy in the present day still remember Quentin's ghost. They still remember what Quentin did. So they must have two sets of memories, one of the previous timeline and then one of the altered timeline, which must be really confounding. And I think they even address this in the Big Finish audio plays, where they actually literally say that when the timeline is altered, the characters have two sets of memories, the original timeline and the altered timeline. So it is confused. Time travel in general, I think, in speculative fiction is very confusing. And on Dark Shadows, it's especially confusing on Dark Shadows, because they're going not only back and forth in time, but they're going into parallel time bands. And but I know what you mean. And it is definitely a head scratcher. Like, you could make a compelling argument that, well, since Vicky existed in the past, she's destined to go into the past. Barnabas should remember who she is when he first meets her. But that has not yet happened in that sequence of events. So I don't know.
Well, it's like you said with your guest and the other shows, and Dan Curtis was going, "Oh, don't worry about making those mistakes. Nobody's going to remember that."
Yeah. Yes.
So he was probably going, nobody's going to be able to keep track of these little time travel things we do. Don't worry about it.
We have to remember, this was prior to the advent of home video. This was, was a one and done thing, and they didn't even know yet that it was going to go into reruns while it was on the air. Dan Curtis was brilliant enough to sort of package it, sell it into syndication after the fact. But if you think about it too, I mean, people take stuff like this for granted in pop culture nowadays. nowadays in TV shows and movies where, oh yeah, they do time travel and all this, and these crazy ideas like this, and astrally projecting and things like this. This Dark Shadows was very groundbreaking.
Yeah. I mean, they put some thought into it. It was not, just like, okay, let's kind of play with this. I mean, when Barnabas comes back, he comes back as a non-vampire. And it's like, you're kind of sitting there questioning, okay, how is he going to come back? Which way is he going to come back? Came back through the coffin, which was just an amazing thing. I thought that was very cool. I thought that was a really good way to tell that story. Mm-hmm. But I'm going a little bit out of order here. So we'll go,
that's okay.
We'll go back to talking about when Barnabas goes to Professor Stokes and says, hey, guess what?
Yes, because of course Professor Stokes had given Jeff Clark, aka Peter Bradford, the herb that enabled him to sort of, and so Stokes tells Barnabas this herb will only work for someone who actually is from that time, and Barnabas hints not so subtly that he actually is from that time, which lends credence to a lot of people debate whether Stokes actually figured out that Barnabas in the present was actually the original Barnabas Collins, because Stokes is brilliant, and he is an expert in the occult as well. So for him to have blinders on in that regard is a bit surprising, but Barnabas all but says he's from that. He says, what if I am from the past, and Stokes says, well, then that's the best kept secret in Collinsport. And Julia's like, I love when Julia's like just interrupts, such a great.
It's dusty in here, isn't it?
Yeah. Yes. Right. And clearly Barnabas is so desperate to get to Vicky, and Julia, of course, thinks this is madness. To do this. This is that he's overreacting to this. But as it turns out, Vicky is clearly in danger, and Barnabas calls upon Peter Bradford's spirit to bring him into the past, much as Peter did with Vicky. He brings Barnabas into the past. Barnabas is now merged with his 1796 self and is a vampire again, with all the memories of the present, and sees his servant, Ben Stokes. Ben doesn't know what Barnabas is talking about. Barnabas.
I know. He's sort of like, are you feeling okay?
Yes. Yeah.
he's asking a vampire, are you feeling all right?
Yeah. Yep. And so Barnabas is thrilled now. Well, not thrilled, but he's here, and he knows he can change history. So they do a recap episode, which is pretty rare. They didn't often do this, but they pulled the tapes from 1795 and put together a clips episode of what happened. And this was a very rare. I can't really even think of another time where they took clips from another storyline and put them together to create an episode.
Yeah.
So we saw the original sequence of events. We know where Barnabas is in the timeline, where he killed Lieutenant Nathan Forbes.
Yay. I'm telling you, I love Joel Carruthers as
he's great
and everything, but as Nathan Forbes, it was like, okay, go ahead.
Well, Nathan he's so out for himself, even to the point where he is trying to negotiate with the vampire who's threatening to kill him at this point. I know. It's hilarious. I mean, he's just really like, wow, that's impressive. That takes a lot of nerve there, Nathan Forbes. So the original sequence of events, Barnabas strangles Forbes, but now Barnabas uses a different tactic, because Forbes, of course, gave false testimony in Victoria Winter's trial. So Barnabas forces him to sign a confession that he lied on the stand. Right. And Forbes, as we said, Forbes initially doesn't want to do. He says, well, I will sign a confession if you sign a confession, Barnabas. So Barnabas bites Forbes, puts him in his power, and forces him to sign the confession. Right. Now, the thing that kind of raised a question for me here is that Barnabas puts Forbes in his power, and once the vampire bites you, you're in the thrall of the vampire. You cannot act against the vampire. And Forbes, I guess maybe Barnabas didn't fully put him in his power, because he did it enough to get him to sign the confession, and he's sort of in this sort of catatonic state and does
Right.
what Barnabas tells him. He has no will
Right.
of his own. But then
Right.
shortly thereafter, he's telling Millicent that
Yep.
Barnabas is a vampire. And then
Yep.
later on, Natalie,
He's trying to put a stake through his heart.
Countess Dupre. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I said, well, that's not usually how it works with the vampires
No.
on Dark Shadows. Usually if you're the victim of the vampire, you lose your will. You are in the control of it. You cannot.
That's right. Yeah. You're compelled to do what they want you to do.
Right. So it seemed perplexing that Forbes would be able to resist that, or maybe Barnabas didn't fully put him in his power, just enough to get him to do what he wanted him to do. I really don't know that one. If anybody has any theories on that one, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know how to feel about that. I mean, it seemed he was like in this catatonic state until Millicent comes to the jail cell, and then all of a sudden he sort of snaps out of it.
Yeah.
Starts talking to him. And now, I mean, other people that have been bitten by Barnabas, like Willie and Maggie, and even Carolyn, it's like they all had the same sort of like sickness about them, right?
Yeah.
So they were really wide awake at night, and they were really lethargic and, just like terrible in the daytime.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, it didn't follow the usual behavior or the rules that they had set up about how people would behave if they had been under the control of Barnabas. So
yeah,
I'm really not sure exactly why.
Maybe some people aren't as susceptible. Like maybe there's some people that can resist, because you see it happen a couple more times later in the show. I know Sebastian Shaw at one point seems to be able to want to stake Roxanne, and there's another scene where Sky Rumson kind of shows Barnabas his fang marks from Megan Todd. So maybe there's some people that are just innately able to resist to some degree. I don't know. It just seems a bit of an inconsistency there that Forbes was initially, because clearly Forbes was like glazed over.
Yeah.
It's like, yes, I will sign that confession, which clears Peter Bradford. The confession is enough to clear Peter Bradford and get him out of prison. But sadly, it is not enough to clear Victoria Winters because there's too much evidence against Vicky, thanks to, accusations from Trask, accusations from Abigail, and manipulations from Angelique to frame Vicky to make it look like so Vicky had a lot going. Poor Vicky. It's like, she had a lot going against her there.
It's like really bad. But I will say one more thing about Nathan Forbes, about him being bit by Barnabas. Mm-hmm. Nathan Forbes was so rotten.
Yes.
It just didn't really influence him in the way that it should, because he was just so rotten to begin with.
Maybe there you go. Maybe he is such a narcissist and so self-centered that nothing can overcome his own arrogance, his own sense of self. It's
true.
Reasserted itself. It's possible. Maybe he has a stronger will. Maybe so.
But I love how Barnabas caught him though, like, because he knew what Nathan was going to do with the crossbow.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Double crossed him and was like, "What's the matter? Had different plans for me?" Huh?
Yeah. I love that too. I love that too, where he comes up from behind him, like he's calling him. He's like, "What's the matter, Forbes?" He's like in the room somewhere, and you hear the dogs howling outside. That's one thing I love too on Dark Shadows, is definitely a callback to Dracula. With the animals are unsettled in the presence of the vampire, and with Barnabas, is you always hear the dogs howling in the background when Barnabas is near, and especially when he's craving blood, you'd always hear those dogs howling. It's such a great effect and so atmospheric.
It is very much.
Yeah. So, okay. So Peter's cleared. Vicky is stuck in prison.
Right.
Barnabas tells Ben this, and they're on the docks, which I always love it when they show the docks, because it's such a it's Collinsport, they're on the docks, and here comes a lady of the night, Crystal.
And Barnabas is hungry.
Barnabas is hungry. It's dinner time. So here comes Crystal. Poor Crystal Cabot comes and she recognizes Barnabas, who most of the townspeople believe that Barnabas has gone away, left for England. The family knows he died, but the townspeople think he left for England. So I guess if they see Barnabas, because he's for Vicky's hanging, he's standing right there among the jailers. So they must have thought maybe, oh, Mr. Barnabas is back in town, I guess,
Right.
So Crystal Cabot approaches Barnabas. She recognizes him. And in one of the strangest attacks from Barnabas, he bites Crystal Cabot and then bites her, and then he stops and then bites her again. And then she falls, she gets away and falls in the water. I don't know what, maybe he, I don't know. It was maybe, I don't know why he did it twice. Did you notice that? Like he kind
of. I was thinking maybe he was feeling guilty because.
Oh yeah. Okay.
He's human Barnabas come back and displaced vampire.
Yes.
And he's probably feeling conflicted.
Yes. Yeah. He's fighting his urge to do. Yeah. Okay, good. Yeah. I think you're right. I think that's exactly what it is. He's fighting the urge he went bitter, and then he stopped himself, and then he did it again, and she got away and drowned. She fell into the water and died.
Yeah. Because I remember one thing that Jonathan Frid said in an interview about being Barnabas the vampire, that he kind of approached it from being a human being with this affliction, and always kind of approached it in that way when he was playing that character.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And it makes total sense what you're saying, like that he's fighting that urge to do that. Ultimately she dies though. And then he goes back to Colin. That's such a great, I love this. This is it's so Angelique. It's such an Angelique thing to do. Like Barnabas gets back to Collinwood. He's in his father's study, and then he turns around and there's the corpse of Crystal Cabot, drowned Crystal Cabot, dead in the chair. And Barnabas is horrified. How is this dead body here of this woman that I just killed? And he leaves the room to get Ben, and he comes back, and there's the great shot of the hand with the rings.
Yes.
And it just pulls back, and it's Angelique sitting in the chair. And it's like, yay, Angelique's back.
I know. And it was really good. And I thought it was really, like, when they show Crystal Cabot there, like drowned, she really looked gruesome and dead. And
yes,
it was like, I thought to myself as I was watching this, I was like, geez, no wonder why I had nightmares watching this. Yes. This is pretty damn creepy.
It really is. It really is. And I said this in the last episode that I did with Stephen Sullivan. It's like Dark Shadows. It really did things that would get under your skin, especially when you were a kid. I similarly, I had terrible nightmares watching Dark Shadows, and I always came back for more because it's the kind of fear that heightens your senses, which is what terror is. It it's fascinating. Like you want to see more of it. And something like that, it's just such a creepy visual to include that scene. And it is definitely a memorable and messed up kind of thing to see.
It really was. Oh, I meant to mention another little childhood thing about Dark Shadows that I used to do all the time. I used to love to draw bats.
Oh, I love it. Awesome. Just in your notebook and stuff.
Oh yeah, I used to draw bats in my notebook. I used to make little ghosts out of tissue paper and and take a black marker and make little eyes. Great. All inspired by Dark Shadows. But
I remember making the ghosts with those dum-dums, the lollipops.
The lollipops, yeah. So Angelique doing that was just amazing, and I thought it was like, hello, I'm back again.
Yes, yeah. Oh, it's great. Yeah, because the last time we saw Angelique was in the present day. She had been Cassandra, and then she was vampire Angelique. She was turned into a vampire for a time, and we didn't see her again after that. Presumably, we find out here actually what happened. She was, as punishment for not succeeding in the present day and returning the vampire curse to Barnabas, she was returned to 1796 with her memories of the future intact and forced to relive her life in that time period. Angelique's timeline, talk about time travel conundrums. And someday I'm going to just devote an entire episode to exploring Angelique's timeline in Dark Shadows, because it's confounding, especially when you get to the last year of the show. It's kind of difficult to make sense of it, but I'm going to try someday. So Angelique is here. So what were your thoughts with this whole bargain Angelique proposes to Barnabas?
So first thing I think is Angelique, I'm like, did Angelique basically come in spiritually and use Crystal Cabot's dead body as a vehicle? That was my first thought. Because it's like, what happened to Crystal Cabot's body? It became Angelique's body. So she must have somehow, basically spiritually possessed the body and took it as her own. And she was, made whole again. The whole bargain. So here's my thing about Angelique. I mean, I love Angelique as a witch, and of course she's an evil witch. And I have some conflicting feelings about evil witches versus good witches. But the biggest thing that I see about Angelique is she's certainly a human being. She's certainly a very and the thing that I find kind of interesting is that she is this fragile human being, a fragile woman, and she's so obsessed with Barnabas and Barnabas's love and wanting Barnabas. It is like that unattainable thing. I mean, she's a witch and she has all of these powers, and yet she cannot obtain his love. And it's just this interesting thing. I think, okay, look, she's got all these powers. She could compel him to love her if she wanted to, right? I mean, love spells are one of the easiest things that a witch could do. And so I find her to be sort of like this, sort of a contradiction. She's powerful on one end and she's totally weak on the other as far as how she behaves. But
Barnabas is her Achilles heel in many ways. I mean, she wants him to come to her willingly, which he did originally.
Right.
So she wants him to come to her willingly, and she won't use her powers to compel him to love her, which is frustrating because she's, like you said, she can't have Barnabas's love, or maybe she knows it's there and Barnabas is the one who's denying it,
Yeah. Well, I mean, Barnabas was, typical guy, having an affair with Angelique before he actually was engaged to Josette, or while he was engaged to Josette. I mean, he was, even as a human being, Barnabas was a very flawed character.
Yeah.
And, ultimately Angelique is a human. So, her feelings were definitely stomped upon by his behavior. I just find it interesting. Like, he didn't come to her of his own volition because she still manipulated the situation. She made his sister sick, in order to compel him to want to marry her. She bargained with him. So I would love to just talk about Angelique sometime.
Yes.
More.
Well, there are many episodes that could be devoted to Angelique. A whole podcast could be devoted to Angelique.
Absolutely.
She's a complex character, like Barnabas. She is a complex character. It's not just black and white with her. She's, she does really evil things, but to her, what she's doing isn't necessarily evil. She wants her way, she wants to do, but she doesn't care who she hurts to get what she wants, which is evil, but, to her, she might not, maybe she doesn't see it that way, but she's murdered quite a few people along the way, as has Barnabas too. I mean, in a lot of ways, they're very similar.
They are
to each other. So this bargain is, she will save Vicky's life if Barnabas agrees to stay as husband and wife, which they were married during 1795, that he would stay with her in that time and not return to the present. That's right. And Barnabas reluctantly agrees to this. Vicky must go to the gallows. She has to be hanged as a witch on the gallows, and that she will put her under spell just before the hanging, and she will release her from the spell after this. Ben Stokes, of course, thinks this is a terrible idea to trust Angelique, because he knows Angelique all too well, because she did some pretty awful things she made Ben do some pretty bad things as well.
Oh yeah, he was definitely her puppet for a long time.
Yeah, so he's said, no, don't trust Angelique. This is a bad idea. But Barnabas is left with very little alternative here. Angelique doesn't like Vicky either, because Barnabas has feelings for Vicky as well. And I'm not sure. I mean, Vicky, I never felt that Vicky reciprocated those feelings in that way. I think Vicky was very fond of Barnabas and cared deeply for Barnabas, but never felt any romantic attraction to Barnabas. Whereas Barnabas saw in many ways, he loves Josette, this ideal of Josette. And
Right.
while Maggie looks like Josette, Vicky actually is more similar to Josette in her demeanor, in his eyes,
Yeah. And talk about not wanting to compel somebody to be with you through supernatural control. He never wanted to do that to Vicky either.
Yeah,
Yeah,
he resisted the urge to do that.
he did.
He finally succumbed to that when she came back from 1795 after she was whisked back to the present. That was when he finally bit her at that time and was going to run off with her to quote unquote marry her, which I assume he was going to turn her into a vampire at that point. Yeah. So, he agrees to this bargain with Angelique, and
Yeah.
Nathan's in jail now. Nathan Forbes, he tries to tell Millicent about Barnabas, and Millicent is troubled because of Nathan. Nathan has really messed with Millicent's mind. Poor fragile Millicent is,
Yes.
Anyway, he's trying to tell her, she doesn't
what's going
on. And then we get to Vicky's hanging, and Peter Bradford is very reluctant.
Right.
There's better work kind of thing. And Angelique is supposed to meet them there. She's supposed to be there, and she doesn't show up.
Right.
She doesn't show. She's a no-show.
And her plan is she did put a spell on Vicky, but she was going to wake her up in a coffin and let her die in a coffin.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
The whole plan of that, which was like, it's just so, I mean, I think the difference between Barnabas and Angelique is their moral compasses.
Yeah.
And doesn't have one for the most part, and Barnabas does.
Yeah. Sometimes Barnabas has one when it's convenient for him.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Exactly.
Most of Angelique sometimes does. It occasionally, especially as the show goes on and she evolves as a character, there are definitely signs that she actually cares more than she lets on, or maybe she evolves as a character. Maybe she develops more human feelings as time goes on, and somewhat develops more empathy. Again, though, if it benefits her. When it doesn't benefit her, she's kind of ignores that, as we see in some instances later on as well. Vicky appears to be dead. Barnabas is devastated. Peter Bradford's devastated. They bring her body back to Collinwood, and Barnabas comes up with this plan to kill Angelique. Which is a really memorable scene on Dark Shadows, and amazing that they actually were able to do this on daytime television with the budget that they had, the effects that they had, where Angelique shows up as she said she would, to meet with Barnabas at that time in the tower. And Barnabas says, "I can't believe you actually came," and Ben bursts into the room with the torch. Yeah. Burns Angelique, sets her ablaze on live to tape TV.
Yes.
Which had blood curdling shrieks coming from the tower. I mean, this is something right out of a Hammer horror film. It looked like to me, very much. Burning the witch in the tower room with the torch. And this is a recurring thing too, where on Dark Shadows, which, I mean, they're pulling obviously sadly from history and folklore as well, where fire is the go-to weapon for witches. Yes. Yeah. And Angelique is, that's her weakness. That's Angelique's weakness is fire. Like the wooden stake for the vampire and the silver bullet for the werewolf. It's the fire for the witch.
Right. And the interesting thing about that, though, as I was watching that, the screams, the screams were the same taped screams they had for when Maggie was having all the nightmares when she first got bit by Barnabas.
Yes. Yep.
I love that scream too. It's a really good scream.
It really is. Yeah. Yep. It's awesome. I remember they brought in an actress to record screams, and she didn't do a very good job. And then Catherine Lee Scott herself did the screams, right? And they were great. And I wonder if that's her screams. I wonder if those are her screams. I'm curious. That's one I'd love to. If somebody knows the answer to that one, drop me an email, because I'm kind of curious about that. I wonder if those were Catherine's screams that were used for Angelique.
Well, that was the same scream that they used when she has the nightmare about seeing her body in the coffin and turns to a skeleton. And I think it's also the same screams that they used for the dream curse.
Oh, yes. Right. Yep. Yeah. I think you're right. An interesting little irony here too. I'm going to throw out Bethia Mapes, who was the good witch, the white witch, who was brought in to try to remove the curse from Barnabas in 1795. Angelique set her on fire, cast a spell to burn her alive.
Oh my gosh!
Angelique killed Bethia Mapes to stop her from removing the curse from Barnabas. So she went up in flames. She burned a white witch. So this is kind of an interesting turn of events here, like just desserts in a way, because she did it to Bethia, so she gets the same treatment. Of course, they say we've just destroyed Angelique for good, which is, of course, as we know, is not
true.
We will see Angelique many times, thankfully, after this. She's so much fun to watch. Her and the scenes with her and Jonathan Frid are just sensational. They're just
and she has such expressive eyes. She's got those big green eyes, and they're very expressive. And she really, she can say a lot just by looking in the camera or looking at whoever she's staring at.
Oh, and that's how she got the part too. When when she auditioned for the role of Angelique, she was playing it like an ingenue, and Jonathan Frid leaned in and he said, she's a witch, she's the heavy, and she wasn't really aware of that. When he told her that at the end of the scene, she gave the camera a hell hath no fury like a woman scorned glare, and she feels that that's what cinched the part for her during the audition. She's told that story a few times. So Angelique is out of the picture now. Vicky wakes up from suspended animation here and is reunited with Peter Bradford. And I almost feel like this storyline was created specifically to give Victoria Winters a proper send-off, because the last time we saw Vicky was a couple of weeks earlier. It was played by Betsy Durkin, and she got pulled into the past with Peter Bradford, and then Vicky's gone from the show. Right. So, and this is a kind of a nice, I wish it had been Alexandra Moltke, but it's a nice send-off for the character with her, between her and Barnabas, saying goodbye. Like she says goodbye to Barnabas, right, and that she feels he will always be with her no matter what. I thought that was nice. Later on, sadly, during the Leviathan storyline, we find out, as many things on Dark Shadows there's no happy ending here. It looks like Peter and Vicky are going to go out west where nobody knows them and start a new life together. And it sounds like Vicky has a happy ending. But then a little over a year later, about a year and a half later, during the Leviathan storyline, we find out that Vicky and Peter at some point came back to Collinsport, and Vicky was murdered by Jeb Hawks, an earlier incarnation of the elder god, the Leviathan leader. Jeb Hawks shoved Vicky off Widow's Hill and killed her, and then Peter pushed Jeb off Widow's Hill, and then Peter was hanged for murder. So it was a really sad ending for Vicky Winters, and I would have liked to have at least one half. Can Vicky at least have a happy ending? Come on. But no, Vicky, sorry, folks. Fans were very upset about that, but it did happen in the show, and it is canon. That's how Vicky goes. But as we know, nobody stays dead on Dark Shadows. There's a way to bring Vicky back. Very easily can be done. Very easily can be done.
Absolutely.
All right. So now that the Vicky story is resolved, Barnabas determines that he must return to the present, and calls to Julia to bring him back. Like he told Julia to meet him at a designated place at a certain time. At 8:00. Yep. At 8:00 to call him back to the present. Because on Dark Shadows, it seems like the way they describe time is that it's almost like you can on-ramp into any time period, because it's always repeating itself. Every day that you have ever lived exists currently, running concurrently with what you're doing now. So if you can find a way to step out, say from today to yesterday at this exact time, it exists. It's there, and that's kind of how they often reference time that way in Dark Shadows. So at this designated time, concurrent with what's happening in 1796, Barnabas wants Julia to will him to the present. But things don't work out. It doesn't. No, they don't. But I like the idea of that theory, because that's almost like parallel universe, like these veils, and and you're standing in the same place in a different dimension at the same time. You walk through the veil into the next dimension, into the next parallel, the next parallel universe, or the next parallel existence that's right next to you. So that idea of that, but it wasn't working for them. I guess somebody's
spiritual will was not enough to make it happen.
Apparently not. Julia was too busy giving people sedatives, and she just didn't have. After Barnabas and Ben destroy Angelique, we find out Countess Natalie Dupre saw Barnabas leave the tower room, and she saw Barnabas die. She saw his body. So Millicent confirms to her that she has seen Barnabas. And so the Countess figures out that, she makes some comment about Nathan and the wooden stake, and the Countess figures out that Barnabas is a vampire. And the Countess plans to avenge Josette's death. Josette, of course, who threw herself from Widow's Hill so that she wouldn't become a vampire. The Countess is going to avenge Josette's death, her niece. So she goes to the jail, gets Nathan Forbes out. Meanwhile, Ben is asked to chain Barnabas in the coffin, because Barnabas decides he needs to be chained in the coffin to be found the same way that Willie found him in the present day.
Right.
So my question, I assume that once Barnabas maybe is in the coffin, that somehow his spiritual essence will then transfer into the present, because it's like, will Barnabas just be sitting in that coffin for 200 years going, all right, only another, another 120 years to go, is he going to, or is it just something where when he goes into his death sleep during the day, when he wakes up, he'll be in the present? Like they don't really explain that. That's kind of, that's kind of a conundrum too, because that is what kind of happens is he's chained in the coffin, and then boom, he's back he's in the present day,
and he's suffocating because he's human.
He's back to being human again. So
he's suffocating in the coffin.
Right. The chains show up on the coffin, and he's brought back into the coffin in his human state. But anyway, before that happens, of course, the Countess and Forbes attempt to destroy Barnabas. They attempt to drive a stake through his heart, and Ben saves the day. Ben actually comes in and stops them, but in a really gruesome, violent scene for Dark Shadows, I thought. Because Ben, who has a gentle soul, I definitely saw some shades of Matthew Morgan here when he was.
Me too. Yes.
Very brutal killing of Forbes. And don't get me wrong, Forbes kind of Forbes deserves to kind of, it just was very harsh the way he broke his back, like on the steps of the
I was really kind of sitting there though when Ben killed Forbes. I was thinking, which way did I like Forbes dying better? But when he killed Countess Dupre, that was very, very sad. And
that was sad, and
it was like he didn't want to, but he couldn't control his own fright and his own terror and his own strength and his own, his own person. He wasn't exactly the most together person mentally or physically, and he was a gentle person, and he felt really, really remorseful about it, and was beside himself about what to do after the fact. Save Barnabas, because he was dedicated to saving Barnabas, because Barnabas treated him so well.
It's true. Barnabas never put Ben in his power or anything.
No, he never did.
He was in life. Barnabas was kind to Ben. And taught him to read and write, and treated him like a human being. Unlike Barnabas's father Joshua, who did not treat Ben very well.
No, not at all.
So Ben was devoted to Ben. In many ways, Ben served as Barnabas's conscience. Like he would try to stop him from doing terrible things. But Ben here now needs Barnabas's help. He said, what do I do? I need you to tell me what to do. He buries the bodies. And Barnabas says, say the Countess went back to Paris and you haven't seen Forbes at all. And of course, we're going to see this revised yet again, because they're going to go back to 1795, 1796 yet again later on, and things are going to be altered again, not with Forbes so much, but with the Countess. Some different things are going to happen with Countess Natalie Dupre. So they really like going back to 1795/1796 and changing things.
But you ever hear, the whole idea of the butterfly effect?
Yes. Yeah. Do you want to elaborate on that?
Well, the whole idea the whole thing is, they say if you crush a butterfly's wing, how many different things does it affect from that one small change? So it's kind of the same thing. It's like the butterfly effect it would have been really interesting if somebody had thought about when they may go back and make a change, how it changed things in the future. If they played with that, I think that would have been a very cool thing to do.
Yeah.
Like they go back to 1795 again or 1796 and Countess Dupre is there, but now a whole nother story plays out, and then you get to the point where you see some crossover of something that happened in the last time they visited that time period. And then there's some choices to be made. Sort of like what they did with Forbes, because they talk about him trying to kill Barnabas and Barnabas kills him one way. But then when Barnabas comes back, he did exactly that. He changed it.
Mm-hmm.
So I just think that's kind of interesting. Again, we could talk, maybe we could have a conversation, like go through all of the different time things and then talk about how that all kind of pieces together, or get some feedback on the whole time continuum, time paradox, parallel universe type of thing. I think that would be an interesting thing to dedicate, a talk to.
Sure. Yeah. There's so much time travel that happens on Dark Shadows that between all the different storylines and then we start seeing parallel universes show up too, that one wonders what is happening to the fabric of time around Collinsport. Like there have to be consequences for that ultimately, I think, because there's so much tinkering and messing with the timelines that something catastrophic could happen. And I think that would have made for an interesting storyline, like a crisis, a time travel crisis, where because of the characters doing all of this tinkering in time, that it's going to affect things in a really bad way unless it's repaired. And then they could have done a storyline where they actually have to set things right again. Okay, so Ben kills them, and Barnabas again tells him to chain him in his coffin.
Right.
And then we cut to the present day, where we see Willie Loomis and Dr. Hoffman in the old house, and they're having a conversation about Barnabas has not returned yet. And what if he never does? Julia is kind of clearly, she's very deeply concerned about what's going on with Barnabas, and Willie is concerned. Willie checks the mausoleum. Barnabas isn't in his coffin. And then when Willie leaves the mausoleum, he turns his back and leaves, the chains appear around the coffin, and there's Barnabas returned to the present in his human state, trapped in a chained coffin in the mausoleum. And as far as Willie and Julia know, he is not there.
And he's gasping for air.
Willie returns to the old house, tells Julia Barnabas wasn't there, and he thought for sure he would be. And then the ghost of Josette appears. Josette's ghost has appeared before when Barnabas has been in danger, notably when the ghost of Trask walled him up in the basement of the old house. So the ghost of Josette appears to Willie, and Willie tells Julia about this, and then he hears the heartbeat from Barnabas paint, which was a kind of a fun, it was a nice nod to the original way Willie released Barnabas from the coffin. But Barnabas isn't a vampire at this point. So, originally, Barnabas is willing him to come to the mausoleum. That heartbeat is kind of just driving him on and filling his head. Barnabas isn't a vampire anymore. So my guess is that there's still some residual, because Julia doesn't hear the heartbeat. But Julia was never a victim of Barnabas, whereas Willie was. So there must still be some link between the two of them. And perhaps Dr. Lang's cure, quote unquote, isn't fully a cure. Like there is still some vampire in Barnabas, so to speak, because otherwise, how is Barnabas able to do these things? Or how are these supernatural manifestations like the heartbeat in the painting? How can Willie still hear that if Barnabas isn't a vampire anymore? So maybe there's still some connection still between the two of them, perhaps.
Well, I have a theory.
Oh, go for it. Yeah.
So, Barnabas, of course, did feed on Willie when he first attacked him way back when Willie was looking for jewelry. And, at that point, there had to have been a little bit of exchange of blood, because even though Barnabas was taking his blood, there probably was some sort of an exchange biologically speaking. So somehow they remained psychically connected.
Right. That must have continued and persisted even past Barnabas's cure, the transfer to Adam of the life
Right.
force, of the draining of the curse, there still must be some element there that links them. Yeah. And so they Josette's ghost crying, the between the heartbeat and Josette's ghost,
Yeah.
Julia and Willie go back to the mausoleum, and they do
They get
find the
him.
chained coffin, and they get him out, and
Yeah.
he is alive. There's the moment of suspense. Of course, we know Barnabas isn't dead, but there's that moment of his Willie's just like, is he alive? Is he alive? Is he dead?
Right.
And then Barnabas opens his eyes, and we are back in the present. And that sort of wraps up this short but memorable storyline in the show.
It does.
Closing thoughts, Robin, on the return to 1796, or on any aspect of it that you want to throw out there that you have thoughts on.
So I've got some thoughts about. So I think it was really done well. I do. Like I said, sometimes I kind of sat there and pondered some stuff about the time aspects, but that's just me being a geek. I mean, sit there and just sort of like suspend all of your disbelief and everything, and just, allow yourself to have the fantasy of the whole thing. It was a great fantasy. It was a great story. And, it was very satisfying to see Nathan Forbes die twice. I really liked that. And I'm glad that, Angelique at least really did agree to put a spell on Vicky, because she could have faked the whole thing and just let Vicky die. So it's a good thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Overall, I think it showed a lot of about the characters. It showed that Barnabas had a lot of love for Vicky, and that Dr. Hoffman had a lot of love for Barnabas, because she would hide herself when she thought that he wasn't going to come back, or how he was going to come back. If he was going to come back as a vampire, she was having a really difficult time with that. I think that Willie as a character at this point just shows how much that he was never really a bad guy. He was always just a really kind of troubled soul, and really a good person underneath it, very, very dedicated to people that he cares about. So, you see, there's a lot of character development that happened, over all of these episodes to this point when they did the 1796 piece. And I really enjoyed it. One thing I do want to mention as we wrap up, I know we're getting close to that time, a couple of things that, you and I have discussed. One of them in the 1790s is the costuming. Kind of questioned whether, and I'm going to ask you, do you think that those costumes were accurate to the time? There seem to be some mixed types of fashions being worn, especially by the women.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think some of the costume pieces were accurate, but I think you're right. I think they mixed in a lot of things that weren't exactly accurate. I was thinking more of actually the men's shoes and the footwear. All the men I noticed in 1795, 1796 wear boots in the show. But if you look at like the 1991 series, or just paintings of like George Washington and stuff, a lot of the times they had like those knee socks with shoes with buckles.
Yes.
And they did that in the 91 series, but in the boots were more, I think, for riding and stuff. But in the 1795, the guys are always wearing those boots no matter what. You don't really see the knee socks, except maybe I think once they had somebody like a priest or something, or a pastor.
Right.
Socks, but yeah,
Trask,
I think
maybe Trask.
And then, but some of the costuming I don't think was fully, accurate, but it was evocative of that time period, but not 100% accurate.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that the Regency style was probably more accurate to that time, the 1790s, like, what they would have Josette in, or even what they would have Angelique in. But like sometimes when they had Victoria, they had her in something that looked a little bit later, more like maybe 1830s or something around there. Something that was a little bit further on in time, at least it seemed to me. So that was one of the things that I noticed about that particular segment. And I noticed it in the original one from the 1795 pieces too. You would see Naomi Collins wearing one style of clothing, and then you'd see, Josette wearing another one, and then Countess Dupree wearing another. And they were all kind of different. It reminded me of like going to the Renaissance Fair.
It was still evocative of that time period, like,
It was.
but it was a mix and match kind of thing going on there. All right, Robin, are you still doing the perfume business?
At this point in time, I'm not. I'm planning maybe in 2022 to actually maybe launch another fragrance. I really have kind of scaled back on it from the standpoint of what I'm trying to do. At this point, I'm just taking it more as an artistic expression. I do plan to, to put it out on some sort of a website in the future. And if somebody wants to buy a bottle, they can. And if not, that's fine. It's more for me and for the love of actually making fragrance at this point.
Okay.
Can I mention two other things that we did talk about? And I wanted to mention this because it was really cool about Dark Shadows.
Go for it.
Okay. So one thing that I love about Dark Shadows, especially the present day, the present 1960s, was such a time capsule of 1960s clothing. Mm-hmm. And I love that. I think that's amazing. In fact, when I started rewatching them, it really inspired me to create some 1960s pieces just to wear, things that didn't look.
Oh, I love it.
But actually kind of, harken back to that style, because it was sort of like the 1920s. The 1960s was so freeing, from a woman's clothing perspective, because, if you had a couple of extra pounds on, nobody cared because you were wearing an A-line dress and it looked great on you, even if you were feeling a little bit out of sorts from a pound or two from, the last time you put the dress on. It wasn't going to make a difference. And I just love that freedom of it. And, that it really, really made you look good all the time. So it wasn't something like, oh, I can't put that dress on because it's so body conscious and, I ate too much this past weekend, type of thing. So I really love that about the fashion, and just seeing all of the different pieces was such a time capsule of really cool clothes.
Totally.
As far as I was, for my aesthetic. So I really love that about Dark Shadows. The other thing you and I talked about was, I would really like to know who was doing those beautiful portraits, like of, even the one that was done of Laura Collins and David and, Barnabas Collins and Josette. Who was doing those paintings? It's never really been talked about.
Yeah, those portraits are so iconic and memorable, and portraits were such a mainstay in Dark Shadows throughout the entire run of the series. To my knowledge, they used somebody at ABC to do that. It was somebody in ABC's art department that they had do that. I don't know the name. I don't, at least over the years that I've been kind of immersed in the fandom and reading the books and the zines and stuff, I don't recall any name being thrown out as far as who the artist is or artists. I'm sure it was probably more than one person. If anybody knows who painted any of the portraits in Dark Shadows, please drop a line, because I would love to know, because I to my knowledge, it was somebody in the ABC art department or multiple artists that they've hired to do that, and that worked for ABC, and their names were never shared to my knowledge.
Yeah. It makes me kind of sad, because I look at those when I'm watching episodes and just think to myself, geez, some really talented artists were working on these pieces.
Yeah, definitely. And pulling references, like I know for the Quentin painting, the Dorian Gray painting, when it ages, I mean, when the old version of it is clearly inspired by the Ivan Albright painting from The Picture of Dorian Gray, the George Sanders movie from the 40s. Like, it's definitely pulled inspiration from, and it looks awesome. It looks really creepy. The old man Quentin in the painting looks amazing. So they do some really great, and of course the beautiful portrait of Angelique in Parallel Time, the Parallel Time version of Angelique. When they do the Rebecca storyline, there's an amazing portrait of Laura Parker, and I don't know who painted that. I mean, it's beautiful artwork. Like, I mean, these are masterpieces, a lot of these paintings. So
yeah, wouldn't it be amazing to actually get a hold of one of those original pieces?
Oh my goodness, yeah. I know Laura Parker has the one from Night of Dark Shadows. She has that in her house. But yeah, I don't know. I know the original Barnabas painting in the foyer during the run of the show was stolen from the set. Somebody Yeah,
Wow.
in 1970, somebody went into the set, cut the painting out of the frame, and stole it. So you notice it looks a bit different as
Yeah.
the show goes on. When you go into 1970, it's like, oh, wait a minute, the Barnabas painting looks a little bit different now. Like they changed a little because it's a different painting. They repainted. They had to redo it.
So the one that was hanging in the foyer, they had to redo, but they also did a portrait for Barnabas that Sam Evans was doing.
Yes, the one in the old house. Yep. I
Right.
wonder where that is now. I wonder
Yeah.
who owns that, you know. Anyway, all right, folks. Well, Robin, thank you so much for joining me for the episode. It was great geeking out with you. It felt like we were just hanging out, geeking out about Dark Shadows. So that was great talking about this storyline. And folks, if you have not done so already, get your hands on the Jonathan Frid documentary. Have you seen it yet, Roberta?
I have not.
It's very heartwarming and amazing, and a fitting tribute to Jonathan Frid. It is available on Amazon, and it is also available on Apple TV. Also, head on over to Hermes Press website, because hermespress.com, because they're reprinting all of the Marilyn Ross Dark Shadows novels, the Dan Marilyn Ross novels. There's also the audio versions of those with Catherine Lee Scott, reading audiobook versions of the Marilyn Ross novels. So check those out as well. So lots of cool Dark Shadows merchandise out there, and I hope that more is coming, because we need more cool Dark Shadows stuff. Can never have enough cool Dark Shadows merchandise out there. Robin, what was the closing line you came up with?
Until we meet again in the Dark Shadows. Good night.
And for as long as they lived, the Dark Shadows never truly dissipated, for there will always be terror at Collinwood. Terror at Collinwood is a Penny Dreadful production.